Imagine lying down to sleep tonight, but instead of your own room, your own bed, your own silence, you are surrounded by 10 other people. Your mother is on one side of you, your younger siblings are pressed against your back, a servant is curled up near the door, and somewhere in the corner, a traveler your father let in for the night is already snoring. The fire in the middle of the room is dying down, the smoke drifts slowly upward through the thatched roof, and outside, the English winter is pressing cold against the walls. This was not a punishment. This was not poverty in the way we imagine it today. This was simply Tuesday night in 13th century England. We tend to think of privacy as something basic, something every human being naturally needs and deserves. But that idea is actually quite new. For most of human history, and certainly for people living in England in the 1200s, being alone was unusual. Being surrounded by others was normal. The house was not a place where individuals retreated to recharge. It was a shared machine for survival, and everyone inside it played a role. To really understand what daily life looked like in medieval England, we have to completely let go of the world we know. No separate bedrooms, no quiet hallways, no personal bathrooms, no space that belonged only to you. Instead, picture a single room. One room where your family cooked, worked, ate, argued, laughed, got sick, recovered, and eventually closed their eyes at night. That one room was the entire home for most people in the English countryside during the 1200s. The houses themselves were built in a style that had been used for generations. Timber frames formed the skeleton of the structure, and the gaps between the wooden beams were filled using a technique called wattle and daub. Builders would weave thin sticks and branches together into a kind of mesh, then coat that mesh with a thick paste made from mud, clay, straw, and animal dung. When this mixture dried and hardened, it formed walls that were surprisingly effective at keeping out wind and rain. The roofs above were thatched with straw or reeds, layered thick enough to shed water and hold in some warmth, though never perfectly. There were no chimneys in most of these homes. A fire burned at the center of the room in a simple hearth, and the smoke it produced had nowhere to go except upward, slowly seeping out through gaps in the thatch and through the air itself. Over time, the walls and ceiling darkened with soot. The air inside carried a permanent haze. Everyone breathed it. Everyone lived with the smell of wood smoke woven into their clothes, their hair, and their skin. The floor underfoot was bare earth, packed down hard from years of use. Over that earth, people spread rushes, which were dried water plants gathered from riverbanks and marshes. Rushes made the floor slightly softer and helped absorb moisture. They also absorbed everything else. Food dropped during meals, mud tracked in from outside, waste from animals that wandered through the door. Fresh rushes were sometimes added on top of old ones rather than replacing them entirely, which meant the floor could become a layered record of weeks or months of daily life. Herbs like lavender or mint were sometimes mixed in to cover the smell, a small and hopeful gesture against the realities of the space. During daylight hours, the room hummed with activity. The fire needed constant tending. Pots hung above the flames on iron hooks, and whatever the household was eating that day, whether it was a thick pottage of vegetables and grains or a piece of salted meat, it cooked slowly over that central fire. Women spun wool or flax on simple spindles or wheels positioned near the light coming through the single small window opening. Men came in and out, bringing tools, repairing equipment, carrying water from the well. Children ran through the space, underfoot and noisy. Dogs were often present too, lying near the warmth or nosing through the rushes for scraps. And then evening came. The light faded early, especially in winter, when the sun dropped below the horizon well before the workday felt finished. Candles existed, but they were made from tallow, animal fat, and they were expensive enough that most families saved them for tasks that absolutely could not be done in darkness. When the fire burned low, darkness came quickly and completely, and into that darkness, The household prepared to sleep. There were no beds in the way we picture them today for most people. What ordinary families had were pallets, simple sacks made of rough cloth and stuffed with straw, dried grass, leaves, or anything soft enough to make lying down bearable. During the day, these pallets were rolled up and pushed against the walls to free the floor for work. At night, they were unrolled and spread across the rushes. The whole family arranged themselves on these mattresses, often pressed close together for warmth. A mother and father in the center, children nested around them, a grandmother or grandfather nearby, perhaps an older child sharing a pallet with a younger sibling. There was no embarrassment about this closeness, no sense that it was unusual or uncomfortable. It was the practical reality of a world where winters were genuinely dangerous, where heating a space required fuel that cost time and labor to gather, and where body heat was one of the most reliable ways to stay warm through a long, cold night. Sleeping close to others was not a failure of privacy, it was a strategy for survival. In larger households, the crowding only increased. Wealthier farmers and minor lords lived in homes built around a great hall, a large central room that dominated the structure and served as the heart of everything. The Great Hall was where meals were eaten, where guests were received, where disputes were heard and business was conducted. Long wooden tables were set up for meals and then cleared away afterward. A massive hearth burned at one end, pushing heat across the space. And when night came, the Great Hall became a dormitory. Servants spread their bedding directly on the stone or earthen floor. Some wrapped themselves in their cloaks and lay near the hearth, where warmth lingered longest. Others used straw mattresses, similar to those in village homes. If travelers had arrived seeking shelter, which was common since hospitality was considered both a moral duty and a social obligation in medieval culture, they too slept in the hall. On any given night, a dozen or more people might be breathing the same air in that single room, the fire dimming slowly, the household settling into sleep together. Even the wealthiest families in England during the 1200s lived in ways that would seem remarkably public to us today. A castle or a large manor house did have one room that offered something closer to privacy. This was called the solar. It was typically an upper room located above or beside the Great Hall, and it served as the personal chamber for the lord and his immediate family. The solar was a step up in comfort. The bed there might have a proper wooden frame with ropes stretched across it to support a mattress stuffed with feathers rather than straw. Thick wool blankets and animal furs piled on top kept the cold away. The windows might have wooden shutters or a covering of oiled linen to block drafts. But calling the solar private would be generous by our standards. Servants moved through it constantly. They came to tend the fire before dawn, to bring food and water, to help with dressing, to carry away laundry, to deliver messages, and to assist with whatever the household required. Guests might be invited in for important conversations. The door might be closed, but closed doors in the 1200s did not carry the same meaning they do today. A closed door was not a signal that the space inside belonged entirely to one person. It was simply a door. What strikes us most when we look honestly at medieval life is not just the physical crowding, but the complete absence of the idea of individual personal space. Modern people carry a strong instinctive belief that they are entitled to certain moments and places that are entirely their own. A room where no one else enters without permission, time alone with their thoughts, a degree of separation from the people they live with. That belief would have been almost incomprehensible to someone living in England in the 1200s. Medieval society was organized around community and hierarchy rather than individual experience. A household was a unit, not a collection of individuals. Everyone inside it, from the lord to the lowest servant, had a role within that unit, and those roles were performed in full view of everyone else. There was no division between public and private self in the way we understand it now. Your life was your household's life. Your sleep was the household's sleep. Personal hygiene in this environment tells a similar story. Medieval people were not indifferent to cleanliness, a common assumption that historians have worked to correct. They washed, they cared about appearance, they understood that clean hands and tidy clothing reflected on a person's character and standing. But the way they washed was shaped entirely by the resources and spaces available to them. Heating water required fuel, which required labor, which was always in short supply. Because of this, full-body bathing was not a daily event for most people. Instead, households practiced a kind of partial washing, rinsing the face and hands each morning, cleaning up before meals, addressing the parts of the body that were visible to others. Wooden tubs were brought out for more thorough bathing when time and fuel allowed, and because heating enough water for a full bath was such an effort, multiple members of the household often used the same water one after another. Linen undergarments, the shirts and shifts worn directly against the skin, were washed more frequently than outer clothing. These garments absorbed sweat throughout the day, and keeping them clean was one of the main ways medieval people managed their personal hygiene between full baths. Laundry was done by hand in wooden tubs, scrubbing with rough soap made from animal fat and wood ash, then beating the fabric against stones to loosen the dirt. Clothing was hung outside to dry in the open air, and sunlight and a fresh breeze were valued as much as the soap itself for reducing smell and keeping fabric clean. Hair was combed daily using fine-toothed combs made from bone or carved wood. Lice were an unavoidable part of life across all social classes, from the poorest village family to the household of a nobleman. Regular combing was the main defense against them. The combs themselves were personal objects, one of the few things in a medieval household that genuinely belonged to an individual rather than being shared with the whole group. Human waste presented one of the most persistent challenges of the era. In ordinary rural homes, there were no toilet rooms. People used chamber pots at night, simple clay or wooden vessels that were emptied outside in the morning. During daylight hours, the practice was simply to go outdoors, away from the immediate area of the house. In castles and larger stone structures, builders had incorporated something more deliberate. These were called garderobes, small chambers built into the thickness of a wall with a hole in the seat above a vertical shaft that dropped waste down into a pit, a river, or a moat below. They were not sanitary by any modern measure, but they represented a real attempt to separate waste disposal from living space, and they suggest that medieval people thought actively about these problems, even if their solutions seem primitive to us now. What is remarkable, looking back at all of this, is not how different medieval life was from ours in its details, but how completely different the underlying assumptions were. We start from a world built around the individual. Our homes are designed to give each person their own territory. Our culture tells us that solitude is healthy, that boundaries are necessary, that personal space is a right. A person living in England in the 1200s started from entirely different assumptions. Life was collective. Space was shared. Privacy was not something you were owed, it was something that occasionally and briefly happened, and you were grateful for it when it did. When people in the 1200s pulled their rough blankets up in the dark, the fire nearly gone, the room full of the sounds of breathing and rustling straw, they were not enduring something difficult. They were simply living, surrounded by the people they fed and worked and argued and laughed with every single day. There were no walls between them and the rest of their world, because for most of human history, those walls had never existed. The quiet, separate, locked-door life that most of us take completely for granted is one of the youngest ideas our civilization has ever had.